Shadows of Cedar Hollow. Warning: this is a work of fiction and does not draw from real events. In the quiet hours of an autumn night, when the cold Maine wind rattled the windows of the aging houses in Cedar Hollow, Ethan Wallace found himself drawn to secrets that the town's silence had long kept hidden. The small town, nestled between the rugged cliffs of Acadia National Park and the dense forests of inland Maine, wore its history like a scar visible to anyone patient enough to observe its worn edges. Ethan, a reserved journalist with a penchant for uncovering the truth, returned to Cedar Hollow after a decade away. His arrival stirred up memories of a childhood filled with whispered legends and half-forgotten fears. As Ethan drove into the town, the asphalt road cutting a lone path through ancient pines seemed to echo with each beat of his heart. The pastel hues of dusk bled into the horizon as he recalled a promise he once made to himself, not to let the shadows of the past consume his future. Yet, something in the air, the mysterious fog and the murmurs of the night reminded him that some ghosts never truly vanish. In the distance, the dilapidated structure of the old Braxton Mill stood against the twilight, its silhouette a testament to a forgotten era of industry, secrets, and tragedies. Ethan parked his car outside a modest inn near the town center, its neon sign flickering weakly against the deepening gloom. Inside, a heavy hush had enveloped the corridor as if the walls themselves bore witness to unspeakable incidents. He registered with the innkeeper, Margaret Hayes, a woman whose tired eyes, tinged with a lifelong sorrow, hinted at having lived through more than her share of heartbreak. "You're not from around here, are you?" Margaret asked quietly, her voice low as though unaccustomed to a tone of casual conversation. "Not anymore," Ethan replied, his voice betraying a trace of melancholy. "I used to call this place home." Margaret's gaze lingered on him before she muttered, "Sometimes, home isn't where you want it to be. It's where the ghosts linger." These words, heavy with implication, would echo in Ethan's mind as he settled into his room. That night, as a storm approached and the rain began its relentless percussion against the window, he lay awake. The memories of a turbulent past, mixed with the present mystery, stacked like layers of tarnished photographs. He recalled bitter words exchanged with old friends and the inexplicable disappearance of a neighbor many years ago, a case that had been dismissed too conveniently by the local police. Now, those unresolved clues were finding their way back into his thoughts. The next morning, over a breakfast of lukewarm coffee in the inn's cramped dining area, Ethan met another local, Detective Charles Rutherford. Charles was a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s with a graying beard that lent him an air of unspoken wisdom. He looked at Ethan with cautious eyes, as if trying to determine whether the journalist's return meant reopening old wounds or bringing fresh insight to long-buried mysteries. "I wasn't expecting you back in Cedar Hollow, Ethan," Charles said, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. "We all remember you. But you know as well as I do that sometimes digging up the past can be more dangerous than leaving it undisturbed." "That may be true," Ethan replied softly, "but some secrets cry out for justice." As the conversation deepened, it became clear that this was no simple reunion. Charles mentioned a series of odd occurrences in town, unsettling letters mailed to residents, strange figures reported on foggy streets at night, and, most disturbingly, a new wave of unexplained disappearances. The detective's tone was laced with a form of resigned terror that Ethan had never heard before. In that moment, the promise of truth and the lure of dark mystery wove together into a tapestry of suspense that Ethan could not ignore. Over the next few days, Ethan revisited old haunts and spoke to familiar faces. He roamed the narrow streets of Cedar Hollow, noticing every detail: a cracked sidewalk, a faded mural on a brick wall, and a lone figure watching from a distance. His search led him to an abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of town, rumored to have been the site of unspeakable events decades ago. The farmhouse, draped in ivy and bearing scars of neglect, seemed to breathe an air of palpable dread. Its windows were dark eyes peering out at a world that had forgotten its secrets. Inside the farmhouse, Ethan discovered remnants of the past: dusty journals, cracked photographs, and a diary that belonged to a young woman named Emily Adams. In her delicate handwriting, Emily recounted her anguish, detailing forbidden love, betrayal, and the ominous presence that haunted her nights. The darkness speaks when the wind is low, one entry read, and in its whisper, it promises both pain and liberation. The diary's entries conveyed an overwhelming sense of isolation, as if the writer's every word was an act of desperation against forces beyond her control. That same evening, while the wind howled outside the inn, Ethan sat across from his old friend, Karen Mitchell, in a dimly lit corner of a local diner. Karen, a schoolteacher with a fierce commitment to the community, had grown up with countless stories about Cedar Hollow's history, stories that most dismissed as local legend and cautionary tale. Over steaming cups of tea, the two reminisced about their youth and the unsettling events that had shaped the town's collective memory. "I remember how the elders used to warn us," Karen said, her voice trembling slightly. "They spoke of a curse that befell any family that dared to dig too deep into the town's past. My grandmother used to say that every secret has a price." Ethan leaned in closer. "Do you believe in curses, Karen? I mean, after all this time, isn't it possible that there is some truth lurking behind those old superstitions?" Karen's eyes flashed with a mix of defiance and fear. "I believe that some things are meant to stay buried, Ethan. But even if it's not a curse in the literal sense, the weight of our history can drive people to do unthinkable things." As the storm intensified that night, Ethan found himself inexplicably drawn to the darkened skies. In the midst of raging winds and rattling pains, he contemplated the forces at work in Cedar Hollow, the interplay of memory, guilt, and the primal fear of the unknown. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on his door. It was a timid knock, yet it carried the urgency of a secret desperate to be revealed. Opening the door, Ethan was met by a young man named Robert Green, whose nervous eyes darted around as though expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. "Mr. Wallace," Robert stuttered, I found something. Something that you need to see." Intrigued and slightly perturbed, Ethan followed Robert through rain-slicked streets to a small storage room behind the local hardware store. There, hidden beneath stacks of old boxes and forgotten tools, lay a series of meticulously organized files. Robert explained that he had discovered them while cleaning out an old storage closet that once belonged to a recently deceased contractor known for his mysterious projects around town. "I don't know what it all means," Robert said in a hushed tone, "but these documents detail a series of experiments and, I think, surveillance on virtually every inhabitant of Cedar Hollow." Ethan's pulse quickened. It was as though the files held some macabre ledger of the town's sins, cataloguing every secret and every misdeed. The documents mentioned a secretive figure known only as Mr. Black, whose hand was believed to be behind a series of unexplained events that had plagued the town for decades. As if summoned by a hidden force, Ethan felt that the very air in the room vibrated with an ominous energy. Over the following week, Ethan pored over the files in his cramped room at the inn. Late into the night, by the weak light of a single desk lamp, he connected disparate threads: a childhood incident with his neighbor Jonathan Reeves, an unreported surge of disappearances, and a disturbing pattern of mysterious symbols found etched into doorframes throughout the town. Every piece fitted together to form a picture that was as terrifying as it was incomprehensible. One particularly stormy evening, as thunder rattled the historical stained glass windows of Cedar Hollow's tiny church, Ethan met with Charles Rutherford at a secluded spot behind the town hall. The conversation was guarded, their voices barely audible over the din of the tempest. "Charles, what do you know about these experiments? The files, do they have any connection to the missing people? And who is Mr. Black?" Ethan asked, his eyes reflecting a mixture of determination and dread. Charles hesitated, his face darkening with regret. "I've been in this town long enough to know that some answers are best left unsaid. There are forces in Cedar Hollow, psychological phantoms, if you will, that prey upon the vulnerable minds of those who dare to question too much. Mr. Black, he's a name that comes up in hushed whispers. They say he was a wealthy industrialist who dabbled in the occult during the early 1900s, using his influence to hide his transgressions. More disturbing is the rumor that his legacy continues through covert experiments aimed at controlling fear itself." Ethan's mind raced. Controlling fear? You mean this isn't just superstition, it's something tangible, something orchestrated? Charles nodded slowly. There are elements in this town that defy rational explanation. People have experienced visions and inexplicable lapses in memory after encountering certain symbols and locations. It's almost as if the town is a living organism, with a past that refuses to die. In the days that followed, Ethan's investigation took him to the very boundaries of sanity. He followed clues that led him deep into the forests bordering Cedar Hollow, where ancient stone structures lay half-buried under moss and vines. Here, amid an otherworldly glow of bioluminescent fungi, he uncovered inscriptions on crumbling walls that detailed a perverse ritual conducted by members of a secret society in the late 19th century. His discovery was interlaced with an eerie familiarity, a connection to the diary of Emily Adams he had found in the farmhouse. Every revelation brought Ethan face to face with the darker side of human nature. His days turned into an endless cycle of interviews, document reviews, and solitary wanderings along desolate roads where the fog clung to the ground like spectral memories. He encountered Lena Carter, an eccentric librarian with an encyclopedic knowledge of local lore. Over her stacks of dusty books in the musty back room of the Cedar Hollow Public Library, Lena recounted legends of a watcher in the woods, a malevolent presence that was said to prey on those who dared to unearth the truth. Many times I have seen strangers, with eyes full of terror, wandering these streets at night, Lena confided, her fingers lightly grazing the spines of leather-bound volumes. It's as if they carry the weight of something unspeakable, a burden that can drive a person to madness. The Watcher might be a manifestation of our own collective guilt, or perhaps something older, something that has haunted these lands for centuries. Every conversation, every obscure document, and every unsettling experience nudged Ethan further into the labyrinth of his own guilt and creeping paranoia. He began to notice that every face in town seemed to hide a secret. Even his closest friend from childhood, Samuel Turner, now the owner of a quaint local diner, appeared to be concealing silent sorrow behind his warm smile. One crisp morning, as mist curled around the perimeter of Cedar Hollow, Ethan visited Samuel in his diner. The air was permeated with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and old memories. Samuel, with his graying hair and kind eyes, served Ethan a slice of apple pie that seemed to exude nostalgia. "You've been away for too long," Samuel said quietly as he refilled Ethan's cup. "Welcome back to Cedar Hollow. But be wary, the past has a slippery grip on you here." "I can't help but feel it's drawing me in," Ethan confessed, his gaze wandering to the window framing the ancient oak outside. Samuel leaned in, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "There's an old tale." He paused, as if choosing his words with care. "They say that if you wander too far at night, you might meet someone from your past, or worse, a specter of your future regrets." As dusk fell over Cedar Hollow, Ethan found his thoughts spiraling into a vortex of introspection and foreboding. The town, with its labyrinthine streets and haunted landmarks, began to feel like an elaborate stage set by fate, a realm where the boundaries between the real and the imagined blurred effortlessly. Unsettling dreams invaded his sleep, merging his consciousness with fragments of the diary, the hidden files, and the murmurs echoing from the walls of the Braxton Mill. One particularly restless night, while the rain tapped incessantly on his window, Ethan dreamed of a faceless entity leading him through twisting corridors beneath the town. In this nightmare, the entity's voice, soft but insistent, intoned cryptic messages: "The past is the key. Fear is the lock." Awakening in a cold sweat, Ethan realized that his investigation was no longer a pursuit of objective truth, but had become a visceral journey into the depths of human vulnerability. Was it possible that Cedar Hollow's dark legacy was not merely a collection of historical events, but an ongoing ritual, a psychological experiment where fear was both the weapon and the reward? Determined to piece together the puzzle, Ethan revisited the Braxton Mill under the pale light of a waning moon. With each creaking floorboard and every whisper of wind, the mill's decrepit corridors seemed to breathe life. In a forgotten corner of that vast structure, he found another journal, this one written by a man named Edward Braxton, the mill's last owner. Edward's ramblings described a transition from prosperity to paranoia, as he spoke of voices in the machinery and strange symbols carved into the beams of wood. They are the marks of the unseen, he had written, the scars left by forces that cannot be tamed. The more Ethan read, the more he felt that the town itself was a sentient archive of its own misdemeanors. Every tree, every creaking door, seemed to guard secrets that were meant to be forgotten. Yet, as he continued his quest, it became apparent that his very presence was awakening something. Locals began to avoid his path, furtive glances, whispered warnings, and sudden changes in mood followed him like shadows. One rainy afternoon, Ethan found himself in heated discussion with Detective Rutherford once more. At a small table in a near-deserted coffee shop on Main Street, the two men faced each other amid the ambient hum of whispered conversations and clinking cups. "I'm serious, Ethan," Charles insisted, leaning forward with an intensity that belied his calm exterior. "There are those in town who would stop at nothing to keep certain truths hidden. You must tread carefully. I've seen what happens to people when they pry. People lose themselves." Ethan's eyes darkened with resolve. "And what about the ones who remain silent? Those who suffer in silence while the truth festers? I can't live with the knowledge that I left a wound unhealed." Charles sighed deeply as if burdened with an ancient sorrow. "Be careful, Ethan. Sometimes, the line between desperate inquiry and descent into madness is thinner than the veil between life and death here in Cedar Hollow." The conversation left Ethan with more questions than answers. His investigation took him to the local historical society, where he met Alice Munro, an archivist whose passion for preserving the town's heritage was matched only by her own haunted past. In the dusty confines of the society's basement, amid filing cabinets and brittle manuscripts, Alice recounted the history of Cedar Hollow with a tremor in her voice. "Many years ago, Cedar Hollow was a thriving center for industry and ambition," Alice began, her eyes shining with both pride and nostalgia. "But beneath our town's hard-working facade, there existed a dark undercurrent, a network of powerful figures who dabbled in secretive experiments. They believed that by manipulating fear, they could control fate itself. And so, the experiments began, leaving behind echoes that resonate to this day." Her words painted an unsettling portrait of a town that had once been complicit in a sinister conspiracy. Ethan felt the weight of history pressing down on him as he realized that the psychological torment he now experienced was not merely the consequence of his own inner demons, but a shared legacy woven into the fabric of Cedar Hollow. Night after night, as the wind whipped through the narrow streets and the fog rolled in like a living, breathing entity, Ethan's journey grew increasingly perilous. Anonymous phone calls, cryptic messages scribbled on bathroom mirrors, and unsettling apparitions in the periphery of his vision all coalesced to form an impenetrable wall of paranoia. While he never lost his rational mind completely, the line between external malice and internal anxiety blurred until he began to question whether the threats were entirely real or manifestations of his own deteriorating psyche. In one stark confrontation on a freezing December evening, Ethan found himself face to face with a man whose presence exuded a chilling, calculated menace. In the shadow of the deserted town hall, the stranger, tall, with cold eyes and a voice as smooth as oil, addressed him directly. "You have stirred up forces that were meant to remain dormant, Mr. Wallace," the man said, his tone measured yet ominous. "Some truths, once unearthed, will destroy the very people who seek them." "Who are you?" Ethan demanded, his voice trembling as much from adrenaline as from the fear creeping up his spine. The man smiled, a gesture that held no warmth. "I am simply a messenger of what has been, and what will be. Be warned, revelation comes at a cost." That chilling encounter left Ethan reeling, yet it only strengthened his resolve. In the ensuing days, he meticulously retraced the stranger's hints, which led him to a secret meeting of a clandestine group gathered in a long-abandoned church on the outskirts of town. There, in the dim light of a single oil lamp, a council of shadowy figures debated in hushed tones. Their identities, concealed beneath layers of anonymity and tradition, seemed to intertwine with the legends of Mr. Black and the experiments of generations past. "We have kept our promise for over a century," one of the figures rasped, and the hunger for control has yet to be sated. Fear, when properly harnessed, can bind a community in ways that love never could. Hidden in a recess of an upper pew, Ethan listened as the conspirators continued their macabre discussion. Their words confirmed his greatest suspicions. The terrors of Cedar Hollow were not random occurrences but a calculated orchestration of psychological manipulation, a centuries-old legacy maintained through ritual and secrecy. The very institutions meant to protect the town were entangled in a web of inexplicable influences and occult undertakings. In a fevered state of inner torment and relentless pursuit, Ethan began to feel as if the labyrinth of Cedar Hollow had become a living entity, a creature that fed on its inhabitants' collective vulnerabilities. He started to perceive figures in the corners of his eyes, and the quiet rustle of leaves in the wind transformed into sinister whispers urging him to stop his quest. One cold night, beneath a moon obscured by tempestuous clouds, Ethan confronted his own reflection in a rain-streaked window. In that moment, he recognized the unfathomable depth of isolation that had overtaken him, the memories of loved ones lost, the burden of unresolved grief, and the horrifying knowledge that he had become part of the very narrative he was trying to decode. His inner world clashed violently with the external darkness, merging his fear with a profound empathy for the town's long-held secret pain. Amid this inner turmoil, Ethan's path converged once more with that of Karen Mitchell. In a desperate bid for clarity, she confided her own long-hidden trauma. "I lost someone dear to me because of the sins of our past," she admitted, her voice breaking in the quiet intimacy of a midnight phone call. "I tried to forget, to move on. But Cedar Hollow never forgives. It clings to you, as if the past is a living, breathing chain that won't let go." Her words reinforced Ethan's conviction that every soul in Cedar Hollow was tethered to a legacy of unresolved fear. In the ensuing days, as he pieced together a mosaic of evidence and emotion, the town seemed to whisper its approval. Doors creaked open with inattentive groans, shadows moved of their own accord, and the flickering streetlights became witnesses to the psychological unraveling that had gripped him. On the brink of what felt like a final reckoning with both the external conspiracies and the internal demons, Ethan organized a public forum at the town's modest community center. The hope was to prompt an honest conversation about the collective trauma that Cedar Hollow had endured for generations. Faces in the crowd quiet, concerned, and sometimes defiant listened as Ethan recounted his discoveries, the hidden files, the chilling encounters, and the symbolic language of fear that seemed to govern their lives. His words resonated deep within the hearts of those present, stirring memories and igniting dormant courage. "We cannot allow ourselves to be defined by fear," Ethan said, his voice echoing in the hushed hall. "It is our shared responsibility to break the cycle of silence and secrecy. The truth may be painful, but it is the first step to reclaiming our lives." In the aftermath of that night, Cedar Hollow experienced a fragile shift, not an eradication of its dark legacy, but a tentative acknowledgement of its scars. The secretive group's influence, though still insidious, began to wane as more voices joined the call for transparency. Yet, even as the town stirred with the promise of renewal, Ethan knew that the mysteries he had unearthed would forever linger as a reminder of the perilous intersection between the past and the present. In the final hours of a long, exhausting winter day, with the sky streaked in pink and orange as the sun set behind snow-laden pines, Ethan sat by the window of his study, reflecting on the journey that had consumed not only his waking hours but his soul. The irony was not lost on him. His search for truth had brought him face to face with his own darkest impulses, as well as the collective memory of a town that refused to let go of its guilt and sorrow. In that quiet moment, he understood that the expedition was far from over. Cedar Hollow, with all its haunted beauty and inexplicable terrors, was a living testament to the complexity of human experience, where every secret, every act of defiance, and every line etched in despair was a reminder that the battle against our inner demons is eternal. As the seasons began to shift and new buds promised a tentative rebirth, Ethan resolved to document every facet of Cedar Hollow's enigma, not just for the sake of historical inquiry, but as an act of catharsis, a way to purge the corrosive power of fear from a community desperate to heal. Though his own reflection still haunted him in the quiet moments before sleep, he took solace in the knowledge that some truths, however painful, must be confronted if there is ever to be redemption. Late one evening, as a soft drizzle replaced the earlier tempest and the streets glistened with the residue of a hard-fought winter, Ethan met with Karen and Charles one final time near the edge of town. Under a sky peppered with hesitant stars, they shared quiet words of hope and determination. "I don't know what tomorrow holds," Ethan admitted, his eyes scanning the dark horizon, "but we will face it together." Karen squeezed his hand gently. "For every ghost of the past, there's a light waiting to be kindled." Charles added gravely, "And sometimes, you have to stare into the darkness to find your own strength." In that moment, as the soft murmur of the night enveloped them, a fragile certainty emerged, a promise that even in the deepest shadows of Cedar Hollow, the human spirit could spark change and reclaim the narrative of fear. The legacy of mystery and despair would remain a part of the town's history, but it would never again have the power to define the future. In the quiet aftermath of that final meeting, as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon and the chill of a new day began to dispel the remnants of night, Ethan Wallace etched the lessons of Cedar Hollow into his heart. His journey had taught him that the search for truth was never without peril, and the confrontation with one's inner darkness sometimes comes at a formidable price. Yet, in that collision of fear and hope, there was also the promise of liberation, a beacon to those daring enough to reclaim their narratives from the ghosts of the past. The story of Cedar Hollow, with all its intricate layers of psychological suspense and human frailty, was far from over. As the town slowly emerged from the grip of its haunted memories, the echoes of its hidden secrets continued to murmur through the cracked sidewalks and winding roads, a timeless reminder that the shadows we cast are as much a part of us as the light we seek. If you enjoyed the story, subscribe to my channel, like the video, and check the description for details on how to support my work.